Good morning. I'm Dusky Cherry, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
All right, good morning and welcome to our Iowa Ideas Conference. My name is Grace King and I'm the K-12 education reporter for the Gazette. During this session, we will be talking about the impact of the pandemic on Iowa youth as a part of the Human and Social Services track. This session will be recorded and I want to remind the audience that you can submit questions during our conversation today. Our panelists are Emily Blomme, CEO of Foundation 2, and Allison Bruhn, Executive Director of the Iowa Center for School Mental Health at the University of Iowa. Welcome to our panelists. We have one more panelist who might be joining us later this morning. It just seems he's running a little late, so we'll watch out for him. All right, let's get started. So in your experiences, how have the needs of youth in Iowa changed or increased during the pandemic?
Sure, I can go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thanks so much for having us here today. Just a little bit about Foundation 2 real quick. Foundation 2 provides crisis mental health services. We provide crisis phone, chat, and text services across the state, as well as for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And then we also have an emergency shelter for system-involved youth and runaway, homeless, and human trafficked youth. So we have seen the needs change in quite a few ways. One of them specifically is mental health, the mental health of the youth, the social isolation, the increased anxiety, kind of managing the unknown. And I think that's putting quite a bit of pressure on not only youth of all ages and young adults, but those of us who love and care for kids.
Absolutely, absolutely. Allison, what about you?
Sure. My name is Allison Bruhn, and I'm an associate professor of special education, and also, as Grace said, the executive director for the Iowa Center for School Mental Health. And I would agree with what Emily said. I think it's not just a problem here in Iowa, but nationwide. And actually, there was just a survey that came out that looked at sort of the relation between school closures during the pandemic and students' mental health. And what they found is that child mental health was worse for older students, also students from low-income families, as well as those that belong to minority racial and ethnic groups. And so I think it's really important to keep those things in mind, that while we've seen sort of widespread mental health issues, it may have, disproportionately affected certain groups of students, whether it be by age or by race.
Sure, sure. Can you get into any more detail? Why might that be? And what are we still seeing, a year and a half into the pandemic?
Well, one thing that they found is that students from minority populations were more likely to experience school closures. And that may have been impacted by SES. And so one of the things that has happened is that a lot of people have decided to put their kids in private school. And so that's one potential reason. When you look at the older group, those are kids that really rely on sort of their social groups and social interaction for a sense of well-being, a sense of normalcy. Those are kids who were also in athletics or in music and school activities that essentially were halted. And so they lost a lot of those socialization opportunities and also kind of how they derive their identity and meaning when they're involved in those things. And so I think that also probably contributes a lot more in to the older age group than it does into the younger age groups.
Emily?
Well, real quick, hey, Dan and Grace, Andrew said he's in the waiting room.
Oh.
So if someone wants to let him in, he would love to jump in on the conversation.
Awesome.
So I would agree with what Allison said. I think the disconnect from social connections that youth are used to having, and then the increased connection to the family connections that maybe young adults, especially the young adults that were living in my house, who were, 17 to 19, it was a lot of family time, which I think is not what my kids were looking for as a junior and senior in high school, or a senior in high school and a freshman in college. And so I think it's just an interesting disruption, and I'm kind of curious to see how that will impact this specific generation, those young adults, as time goes on. I had told Allison and Grace earlier that I was going to talk a little bit about my personal life with this. My kids are now 19, 20, and 23, and my two that are in college are so ridiculously independent now, I think because they just were so tired of being connected to their parents at a time when typically they're not.
I will say, sorry.
Go ahead, Allison.
I mean, I'm a college professor, and I have little kids at home, so it's a little bit different, but teaching online all year last year, and rather large classes, I saw a huge increase in the number of students who would come to me saying they were struggling, or emails that they were struggling, and just with anxiety, with, whatever it may be, managing all of their online classes, because usually they weren't being educated in that way. So just like the organization and structure and time management and self-awareness and all of those sort of self-determination skills really were put to the test for our college students, because they also had a lot of things taken away too. So just anecdotally, I can say that there was a big increase in that. I don't know if we want to bring Andrew into this.
Dan, can you help me out with that?
Oh yeah, because he's on mute.
So in the meantime, Emily, you said that your kids are more independent. What are some of the challenges of that at such a young age, being this independent? And also, have you seen students on the other side who need more help than they did before, and maybe aren't at those milestones of independence that they should be?
Absolutely. So I think often like youth that are in our shelter that we're seeing definitely have a higher need. Part of that's just because of past traumas that they might have, past challenges that they might have, social connections that were really important to them that were disrupted. My kids that lived at home with me, had connections, probably have less of a trauma history than maybe some of the youth in our shelter, but also, they just have a desire to really kind of figure out stuff on their own. And college has been a good place to do that. I will also say that, I had a freshman in college last year who absolutely, Allison, struggled 100% with online learning. And it was really detrimental to him to have to figure that out when he transitioned from, in-person classes in high school to college. And that's already a difficult transition, let alone with things that you expect to maybe stay the same that have been different. Hi, Andrew, welcome.
Yeah, really sorry. I'm just joining you. I sat in the waiting room for a little bit, but was late coming from another meeting. So grateful to be here. And I'll just jump in wherever you want me to.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit, talk about your background and
Sure.
why you might know a little bit about what students have experienced during this pandemic?
Yeah, well, I don't know as much as Emily, so I'm glad to have her here as well. She's doing a great job in Cedar Rapids. Andrew Allen, President and CEO of YSS. We're headquartered in Ames, but we've got operations around Central and North Iowa and a few statewide contracts serving kids who age out of the foster care system in conjunction with organizations like Foundation 2. We're also doing adolescent addiction treatment in a residential setting for kids from across the state. So, helping 10,000 kids and families over the course of the year, and really focused in the areas of prevention, emergency services, behavioral health, and transition services. And while my title is CEO, my most important title is alumnus. I came through YSS programming 2.5 decades ago, a while ago. So really credit the organization with saving my life. I spent some time in the corporate sector and then just felt called back to do this work, and have been in the seat for about 6 years. I love this idea of ideas. One of our core values is innovation. And so sure appreciate the Gazette for putting this on, for bringing people together, and for having this conversation. I've got the sense that while this is my vocation and my work, these are the conversations that are taking place across the state in different forums. I met with someone that works for a utility company recently, and they said they had a PAC meeting to talk about utility type stuff, and the conversation evolved to mental health and kids and the impact of the pandemic. And so I just don't think that there's a conversation that you can participate in today where people aren't asking questions about the impact of the pandemic and how we can ensure that we're doing everything we can to support kids and families from across the state.
Absolutely. That's so true. Andrew, could you talk about a little bit what you've seen at YSS during the pandemic? What needs of the children and families you serve, has it increased this past year and a half?
Yeah, I would say we've seen both increases and decreases. So sometimes it's easy to just talk about, the significant need, because we know that trauma, creates issues, and those issues need to be treated. Obviously with isolation, obviously with, increased stress and anxiety and uncertainty, we know that behavioral health needs have increased. That said, I think that the pandemic also pushed people further from accessing services. Access is a big deal. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we get the right treatment to the right family at the right time. And I also personally, with a 17-year-old boy and boy-girl twins that are 15, have tried to access services for my kids and felt apprehensive on the front end. Gosh, is it as bad as I think it might be? The 500-pound telephone, to pick it up and to actually call someone for help. And if I'm in the field, if I've experienced, behavioral health issues myself, if I know where all of the resources are, you just think about how difficult it is for a parent to reach out on behalf of their child to ask for help. There's still a lot of stigma that exists around behavioral health. I hate to say that. I think we all know it. I'm in the midst of it right now. YSS is working on a big project to cite a nature-based campus setting for really holistic, trauma-informed behavioral health care for kids from across the state. It's an amazing opportunity, and I've got neighbors who are worried that kids are going to escape our facility and hurt them, or they just don't want these kids in their backyard. And while NIMBY is nothing new, the stigma still exists. People think that kids suffering from mental health issues or people are bad people, right? These are not bad people trying to get good. These are, sick kids trying to get help. And so I think that we've got to normalize the conversation around mental health. 1 in 2 of us over the course of a lifetime, 1 in 6 of us will have a mental health need. 1 in 6 will have a substance use disorder. So I really feel like we've seen definite increases in the acuity. So the needs of the kids that we're serving, but in certain areas, I feel like we've actually seen fewer kids and families reaching out because of the access to the barriers to access, which the pandemic has exacerbated.
Absolutely. Emily, I know you had a crisis line number. I think this would be a great place to share some of those resources.
Absolutely. So the Foundation to Crisis Line has been around for 50 years. We also have the contract for Your Life Iowa, which is actually probably the best. It's a statewide line, so it's the best one to represent on this call. You can go to yourlifeiowa.org. The number is 855-281-8555, I think. I don't say it very often. But let me double check that real quick.
You just Google Your Life Iowa.
I did, yes. And so
581-8111.
581-8111. Andrew, thank you.
I just Googled it too.
And you can chat and text off that line too. So, it's interesting that Andrew talks about the acuity because we've seen something really similar. So we've seen higher acuity on calls lasting longer because the needs are higher. People may be calling back more often because they're having a hard time getting into services. I think the pressures on the system continue to be, really posing challenges for people getting, the right care at the right time in a way that makes sense for them. And so between phone, chat, text, we're also seeing, mental health is not something that only impacts low income families. We're seeing this particularly with maybe families that are not as vulnerable, that might be in a higher socioeconomic status. And I love what Andrew said about, the utility company and this conversation that kind of changed over to the challenges of kids. Our philosophy is every time there's a kid in crisis, there's almost always an adult in crisis. And I think when we look at what's our responsibility to the system, the responsibility is to support kids, absolutely, but it's also to support the families and the people that care about these kids that are kind of that first line of defense for recognizing what are the signs, what should we do, where are the resources, how can I help myself be healthier so then I can support my kids and the kids that I care about.
So what advice would you give for adults, parents, guardians in these kids' lives? How do you do that in a healthy way and in a way that you're really communicating?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I would recommend. One, I think it's really important to show kids that it's okay to struggle. I've always been really honest with my kids, with my team, with my own mental health issues, being able to really own those and recognize those and talk openly about those. So therefore, my kids have always known, like, there's nothing wrong with people who have mental health issues, even my mom or even my dad or whomever that they know. So just being really honest about your own struggles, I think sets a great example and sets a good tone that those open and candid conversations are okay to have. So that's one thing. I also think just trying to for adults who are in positions of power, for adults who have loud voices, to advocate strongly for what our system needs to make sure that we are continuing to build a system that provides access, that's free, to make sure that there's legislation out there that allows people to get the support that they need when it makes sense for them at a cost that is reasonable and not a barrier.
Andrew, you spoke a little bit about that, the barriers to resources like this. Why is it so difficult to get these services in Iowa?
It's a hard question for me to hear because, Emily and we're providers of said services. So I really want to think that we're doing all that we can to lower barriers. Like I said, I think some of it has to do with the stigma, and it's just hard to reach out and ask for help. But I will have to acknowledge that that the systems are not always talking to each other, and there's a complexity that exists that if one provider or one point of entry into a system asking for help isn't the right point of entry, you might not get the connection made to the provider that can support the service. There's a few things going on. One is the development of the children's behavioral health system. So it kind of sounds strange, but there's a lot of providers that have been doing this work, but an actual true system didn't exist until 2018, and then some legislation in 2019, and really focused on core services. So there's lots of people across the state working at different levels to ensure there's no wrong door to get access. You're familiar with 211, which is oftentimes supported by United Way, where you should be able to call and get a point of entry into services that you're looking for. Emily's working on a big project 988 that's rolling out across the country. Those non-emergency mental health needs, where should be a single front door point of entry to get people connected to services. So I think that just by nature of the complexity of the problem, the systems that have been built to address the problem are also complex, and we need to work to reduce the barriers and ensure that we've got strong communication. But if there's people on here on this call that are probably looking for help, but there's also people on this call that know people that are looking for help. And so just to continue to encourage people, I think that had my dad 25 years ago, the first time he was told no, we don't have a spot for your son, had he not just continued to champion my needs and advocate on my behalf, you'd have obviously a different speaker today. And I just would encourage everybody to just be persistent, to keep pushing, to keep asking questions, because the services are there. We've got many of the pieces in place. It's just sometimes hard to access them.
One thing I would add,
Go ahead.
to that in terms of barriers to service, I mean, I come at this from a school-based perspective, is that we have a huge shortage across the country in school counselors and school psychologists who would be able to serve students in schools. And so that's also, the workforce is a problem. And that's, it's nationwide, but it's also in Iowa, and it's actually worse in Iowa than in many places.
Yeah, that's a great point, and leads perfectly into my next question. Is schools and educators are seeing a lot of this. Kids spend a lot of their day in schools, and educators aren't necessarily trained to deal with students' behaviors, mental health behaviors. So what are some solutions to this? How can educators help their kids better? And what are some resources that educators can use as well?
So I can speak to this one. I would say the first thing is that they need to prioritize social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs right off the bat. I mean, we're here in October, but I know, with school starting in August and September, that many school districts actually did say that that's where our focus is going to be, but it can't just be, the first of the year. It has to go throughout the year. And so I won't get too far into the weeds, but really integrating, both academics and the social, emotional, behavioral support in schools is important. There are ways that schools can identify students who have some mental health needs. One way is through universal systematic screening. I know schools have often been hesitant to do that, but I would say that's a highly recommended practice, because often what we see is kids who get support in schools are the ones that are the most disruptive, but kids that maybe fall through the cracks a little bit more are the ones that are more anxious, shy, withdrawn, internalizing type of issues that may not draw the attention of the teacher. Now, those things can happen comorbidly, but those are the ones that we worry about missing, and universal screening can often pick that up. The other big thing is that creating a positive school climate and classroom where, expectations for what you want to see out of your kids are taught and they're acknowledged when kids do those, and that you create an environment where students feel comfortable talking to you and they're able to develop positive relationships with adults, so that when there is an issue, they have somebody that they can go to. So those would be kind of the main points, I would say.
And I would throw in, being able for schools to rely on community partners. There are a lot of really great partnerships. There are many in Cedar Rapids with us, Foundation 2, with Tanager Place, with Grantwood AEA, where there are experts in the field of mental health who are able to support school administrators and teachers, not only in the moment with particular students, but also with some gatekeeper training, helping them understand not only signs and symptoms, but it may be easy to spot a child. It may be much harder to know what to do for them, or what, what's available for them. And I don't think, that teachers necessarily get into the field because they have this, the desire to help, but not in particular ways relating to mental health. And they often feel unequipped to really provide the support that they know their students need. I think they're in a really difficult spot as they're stretched thin. I also think focusing on basic needs, we know that basic needs absolutely improves mental health and improves the, kind of that socio-emotional well-being. So when we look at housing, when we look at food insecurity, when we look at, traumas in families, like what is it that we can connect families to resources where they're going to get some of those basic needs met, which then kind of trickles down into improved mental health, improved stability, and then improved ability to learn in the classroom.
We have a question from Wanda. She's asking if there's resources and specialists like that who can work with students with disabilities or delays. So how have those students who need special education services also been impacted by the pandemic and impacted differently?
So that's been a tough one. Initially, I know like some local districts, and I'm sure this was an issue nationwide, first had an issue with finding their kids. So a lot of kids who were on special ed caseloads couldn't be located. They had either left the state or moved, or, there were all sorts of things. So that was problem number one. There was also an issue about whether or not school districts didn't know, do we have to carry out the legal requirements of the IEP? So the IEP is basically this legal agreement or document that states all of the specialized instruction and services, modifications, accommodations that a student with a disability will receive as part of their education, their right to a free and appropriate education. And so when schools went remote, people didn't know, well, do we still need to do that? Because it's a completely different situation. And that actually impacted initial decisions for districts as to whether or not, you think back to, March 2020, whether they were going to still have school, mandatory instruction, or if it was just going to be optional. And many districts elected not to do anything. And part of that was because of the special ed issue. But at the end of April, Betsy DeVos in 2020 made it very clear that, yes, you have a legal requirement to carry out the IEP. During that time, I think it was May, myself and a few colleagues conducted a nationwide survey of special educators and related service providers, so behavior specialists, school psychologists, counselors, on how they felt they were meeting the needs of kids with emotional and behavioral disorders and carrying out IEPs. And sadly, but not unexpectedly, they rated themselves. This was on a scale of 0 to 10. I think the average score was around a 3 or a 4. Wow. For how well they were meeting those needs. And so if teachers and counselors were not feeling like they were able to do that, then you can imagine what the services and supports that those kids with disabilities received. The other thing is, you think about for an entire year, many of them were online, many of them, for the whole year. Some of them were in hybrid situations, but a lot of the services that kids with disabilities get may not be able to be delivered through Zoom, right? So for kids that need like occupational therapy or, lots of different things, a lot of interventions and supports are meant to be delivered in person. And so that's been difficult. So those kids who were already, behind in some respects, or where there was a gap educationally, that's been exacerbated dramatically. And I would bet that, we're going to see those effects in years to come, unfortunately.
What are some of the solutions? How can we help these kids get back on track?
Well, it seems, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
No, you by all means, go ahead.
Well, I think, being back in school in person is going to be helpful, but I think, like Emily said, there's going to have to be a lot more kind of community engagement and supports from outside the school, because the bottom line is there are only so many people to go around in the school, and like kids with disabilities need a lot more individualized, specialized instruction. And so we can continue to, say, let's keep doing that. And we have to do that, but there may have to be more outside of the school as well.
Andrew, do you have something to add to that?
I was just going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I think just as individuals, like what can we do? As I think about the problems, and I don't know how much we talked about, just again the issues in schools. We're seeing lots of central Iowa for sure. I think across the country, really, lots of violence, lots of conflict, I talked to an associate principal a couple of weeks ago, and she said, gosh, yesterday was a bad day. And I said, what's going on? She said, last year, all year, we had 4 fights. Yesterday, we had 3. And so I think that, this is not my professional perspective. This is my Andrew perspective. I do really feel like many of the kids in the system, foster care kids, and even to a certain extent, I don't know as much about special needs kids with special needs and special education, but they have experienced trauma and disappointment, and they are hardened to a certain extent because they have they've felt pain and anxiety and depression, and so I definitely know, like Emily and I said, the acuity of some of the kids that we're working with has increased, but you've got a whole segment of the population that hasn't experienced the adversity of something like a pandemic. And so they're almost new to trauma and to the difficulty and the struggle. And I think we're seeing that manifest itself. And so I see Peggy on the line and other just mental health advocates that we really just have to get the word out. That this is not an isolated, this is not bad kids, this is not a moral failing, that all kids, need to be focused on mental health, especially in the school setting, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And what I think, again, this is Andrew talk, what I think that we can do as a community is really lean into civility. I see it in my neighborhood. I see it on my Facebook feeds. I hear it from my kids as they come home from school. It's become acceptable to be confrontational, to take extreme views, and to put people down who don't believe like we do. And I think that our kids are learning it from us. And so I just really, I think Barry Griswold, the old CEO at Principal Financial Group, he was talking about civility 15 years ago. So this is sure nothing new. And I think every generation thinks the generation to come after them is the worst, really struggling. But man, I'm concerned about the decorum. I'm concerned about the acceptance of incivility in ways that people, that we're not calling each other out, that we're not, demonstrating it because our kids are watching.
I think that's an important point, both for parents and for teachers, that you're modeling that. But for parents, and maybe, this is me now stepping back, not as professional, but as a parent, monitoring what your kids are taking in. So like I rarely have the news on anymore because of civility issues and just the amount of anxiety that some of that creates. But things like, I know some of my friends who are educators across the country, have texted me with stuff about this new TikTok challenge, where kids are being challenged to really be disruptive and, uncivil, punch a teacher in the face. Crazy things that are happening on social media and being carried out in schools. And so one of the things that some schools have done to combat that is to have, a TikTok like positive challenge, like thank a teacher, do something kind for your peer or whatever. But just the fact that that's even out there, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Allison, I was having a conversation the other day about Ted Lasso, and I don't know how many of you watched Ted Lasso, but basically the conversation was, why can't we all just be more like Ted Lasso, where there's just this absolute genuine kindness and vulnerability that is like every time I watch the show and he responds, I'm like, why can't I do that more? Why can't I be more like that? And so, it is interesting to think about my own behavior. Who am I modeling for? What's my responsibility to the people who see me do my work, to the people who are exposed to me, to hold myself accountable to setting that good example. And I just wish we had more adults who were doing that. I remember my youngest, who was 17, almost 18, asked me at the very, very beginning of the pandemic what I did last time there was a pandemic. Like, hey, Mom, what did you do last time there's a pandemic? And I think I absolutely terrified him when I said, that this hasn't happened before. It's not happened in my lifetime. I don't know. And it was a reminder to me how much our kids look up to us and look up to the adults they trust for cues on what to do and how to do it. And for those of us, of course, all of us who haven't done this before, we have to manage our own stuff and be honest about those challenges in a way that sets good examples and really supports the young adults and kids in our life. It's not easy.
Yeah, I think that's such a good reminder. What all of you have said is there are not bad kids. There's just kids dealing with this impossible situation that all of us are learning how to navigate. So what are some solutions to kind of helping the children and youth in our communities navigate this now and for the years of trauma that is to follow?
Well, I definitely think the mental health follow-up from the pandemic will be months and years. I think suicide rates are absolutely increasing in many areas of the state and of the country. I worry significantly about that. That's part of the business that we're in, the suicide prevention, intervention, and response. And I really think one of the best ways to care for our kids is to make sure that our caregivers are getting the support they need. So that feels kind of like this indirect, this punt to some extent. But if our parents are getting what they need, if our teachers are getting what they need, if those who are working in the field supporting kids are getting what they need, they're going to be more readily available to support our youth and young adults. And so, if you're one of those who is supporting kids, assess yourself, check in. Are things more difficult now than they have been? What resources do you have available to you? I am a firm believer that everybody benefits from therapy. I benefit from therapy. My family and the people that work with me are absolutely grateful I'm in therapy because I'm a lot better to manage because I am. And so I just think, how do caregivers take good care of themselves so then they can take good care of the youth in their life?
I like it a lot, what Emily just said. And I do think this is probably not the right forum for this, but there are also a lot of champions and advocates on this call that could help carry the banner some. I think that there have been sectors of healthcare that have done a good job at ensuring that they've got really solid rates to deliver great services. You just think about, some of the hospitals that I walk into, it looks like they're doing okay. I know the doctors are making, really good money. Even, some disability services, some folks a while ago probably advocated on behalf of, people in need, and they got good rates. Rates, reimbursements, funding for mental health care is lagging. Funding for child welfare is lagging. It's not a business model that, you've probably got a lot of business people on this call. It's not a business model that you'd sign up for. As a matter of fact, a lot of groups are getting out of it because it doesn't make sense. It is hard work, and the reimbursements are low. And the very best way to get focus on mental health, behavioral health, is to start paying providers more, because what will happen is that the best investment you can make is in Emily's shop or YSS or a nonprofit organization. University of Iowa is a great place to invest your funds too. But the difference between a for-profit organization and nonprofit organization is not that you can't make a profit. We can actually make a profit. It's what you do with it. We can't assume wealth. What we have to do with a profit is reinvest it back into our mission. So it is a smart thing to create a business model for organizations that are working in behavioral health to make money, because what we're going to do is we're going to hire more psychiatrists. We're going to pay our clinicians more. We're going to keep people longer such that they can provide higher quality service. So I again, probably not the how can you help answer that you were looking for, but we're in a key period of time right now where mental health are getting, it's getting a lot of attention. There are groups working on increased rates, Peggy's group, but all of us are working on it. And I feel like we're getting to a tipping point where either we're going to have to pay people more, or Emily and I are seeing folks, getting out of the space entirely.
Yeah, Andrew, I don't think we can have this type of conversation we're having without talking about the money. We talked about the challenges of hiring people in Iowa, and that's part of it, is that there's just not enough incentive to come here, not enough incentive to get into the field. Thank you for saying that. Emily, did you have something that you'd like to add?
No, Andrew did a great job. I don't need to say anything.
Great. I just want to remind our audience that you're welcome to submit questions. Andrew, I don't know if maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you're seeing from children who are experiencing homelessness or are in foster care. How has the pandemic impacted them?
I think like a lot of other segments as well, the thing that I generally say about kids that are homeless, or, especially those that have aged out of the foster care system, is kind of where they're starting from. When I have a bad week or a bad month, as a young person, I was calling home, hey, I had a bad week. These kids don't have any place to call home to. So I really feel like, additional attention as it relates to, connecting kids to resources and services. Emily and I are part of, a team that's working with kids who've aged out of foster care and advocating on their behalf. We got increased funding recently to provide higher rates, which was important to pay our employees. But we also decided that it was important to provide not just 3 years of service, but 5 years of service. Kids' frontal lobes are continuing to develop into their mid-20s. And so, I like to think intently about specialized services for kids. Too oftentimes you've got competing priorities, adults versus kids. And, kids, turn adults at 18, but really they're still developing into their mid-20s. So I do think that the plight for kids that are homeless, are part of the foster care system, they're starting at a much different spot, and it just requires more support.
And I also think from a socioeconomic status, they're definitely on the lower end. And so they may feel things more impactfully. So, there's job loss. They don't have families that can step in like I could for mine to support my young adults. It could instantly lead to food insecurity, homelessness, increased risk-taking behavior just to stay alive and just to, find a place to sleep. And so I think the impact can be a little bit deeper, which also means that it's further to get back up to a baseline of a good quality of life. And that can be really detrimental to our young adults who are homeless or at risk of homelessness.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about accessing therapy. I think, Emily, you talked a little bit about your experiences with this, but it could be scary for someone who's never been in therapy and counseling to think about doing that for the first time. Like, what does that actually look like, sitting in an office like that, talking to someone about your feelings?
Yeah, therapy, I think, can be really beneficial, but I think it is hard to pick up the phone and call. And our younger generation, who is so used to texting, and it's really difficult for youth and young adults to pick up a phone and have a conversation and kind of advocate for themselves. A lot of therapy now, I think, is still set up as telehealth, which, the first time I did a telehealth session, I'd done, face-to-face therapy for many years. And then pandemic happens, I do telehealth. And I thought to myself, this cannot be as effective as sitting across the room from someone, but I was absolutely wrong. It is, and it can be. And so I just recommend that, you lose nothing by trying therapy for the first time. No one expects you to come in and dump out your entire life in front of them. You can focus on issue by issue and kind of bite off in small pieces, which I think, just going and being able to talk to someone who's outside of every situation. So, we can tell our partners or our spouses something, but then there's the wonder or worry, will they resent us later for it? Or we can tell a friend something, but are they going to judge us on that? Like, the purpose of a therapist is that they're outside of every situation. So they're there for you, only for you, and the risk of kind of long-term negative impact it goes away, but the possible benefit of long-term quality of life issues, I think, increases. And so I highly recommend therapy. And I think health insurance companies, for the most part, if you're insured, you can pay a copay, and there's value to that. I do think that we're running into issues where there isn't enough clinicians. And so even people who want therapy may have to wait longer. They may have to maybe start with someone who they don't know or don't know anything about. And I just encourage people to try it. And you'll know within 3 or 4 sessions for sure if it feels like it's a good fit for you.
Yeah, I think I like that. I also, there's the Make It Okay campaign, which is like, let's challenge perceptions about mental health. I would love to make it cool to have a counselor, right? Emily talked about it. I've seen therapists. On the East Coast, on the West Coast, it is cool to have a counselor. It's just a thing to do. And it's not a new thing either. And so, doggone it, you go see your physician on a regular basis, you get your annual checkups. It's a good thing. It's cool. If you don't have a therapist, well, why not? Like, what's wrong with you? So I would love for it to be cool. I think we as providers need to look at our spaces a little bit differently. We need to think about, how do we make it cool? Can you have a coffee shop therapy place, or, whatever it might be. The one other thing is, it's as easy as it's ever been today to talk to a therapist because of telehealth. So you don't have to go sit in a 10 by 10 room on a couch in a uncomfortable setting initially. That is really beneficial for a lot of people, especially kids that we serve. But today you can sign up online and you can do a virtual meeting over chat. Because of the legislation that was passed, we got parity so that providers like YSS and Foundation 2 get paid similarly between a virtual session and a face-to-face session. So it's easy. And there's employers on the chat. YSS, we don't have any copays for mental health visits. And to be honest, if you're a CEO or an employer, like I thought I had heard that. And when we re-upped with Wellmark, we went away from them because it was so expensive, but we got back to them. There was like a 10 or a 20 or a $30 copay, whatever it was. And all I did was I asked, I said, hey, I think I remember something about no copay for mental health. They came back with a quote. It was we pay the same cost. It didn't cost us a penny more, and they got rid of the copay, which I feel pretty good about.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about therapy, being able to just do it all online, and not have to leave your house, just to try it for the first time that way, I think could make it more accessible for someone who's a little bit on the fence about whether or not they want to do it. So,
Grace, I also think that because we have business leaders on the call, we've done a lot of consultations with business leaders in the Cedar Rapids community who have struggled making sure that the space where their employers work is a space that's able and willing to manage mental health. And so are there EAP services that are available? Can you max those or put no limit on those? How can you have candid conversations with your team and really build a culture that allows for mental health? That will trickle down to kids. If we have our adults who are going to work, who are working in a space where it's cool to have a therapist, where it's acceptable to talk about your mental health challenges, where there's leaders, top leaders who are talking about their own stuff in an effort to continue to build relationships with their team about the value of managing good mental wellness, like that will trickle down to kids and families who are part of that employer. And I think it's just an excellent way that businesses can support the good work that nonprofits are typically doing. So it's just another avenue to kind of get at the whole family and the mental wellness of everyone.
I love that we can have such a candid conversation about mental health. How do you think the pandemic has made that easier, maybe for people to talk about and more acceptable? And how can that trickle down to the youth in our community years down the road?
That's a great question. I had a conversation pre-pandemic. I was doing a focus group with a business leader who had told me that at his place of employment, there wasn't any mental health issues. He had said like, nope, everyone's good. Like, that's not a service that we would use. And I said like, okay.
Same with our school district. Everything's good at our school district too.
But what was interesting is middle of the pandemic, he called me and he said, not only are my people okay, my family isn't okay. And I don't know what to do. I'm feeling really lost. Can you help me with this? And so the pandemic, I think, has made it more socially acceptable to have mental health issues. I think it's impacting so many people that if you actually say like, I don't have a mental health issue, I think everybody will call BS on it. And I think that it's kind of the way of the world right now, like maybe varying levels of mental health issues, but between the anxiety, trying to manage the unknown, the isolation that was forced upon us in an effort to keep everybody safe and healthy, it impacted so many people in so many different ways. I also think that the kind of lull we had in maybe May, June, early July, where people kind of felt like they were getting back to some normalcy before the Delta variant really reared its ugly head. I do think people realize like the importance of social connections, the importance and the value of being with your people in a way that makes sense for you. And so I think everyone's experiencing it. People just aren't always sure what to do with that. And the most important thing to do with it is acknowledge it and then figure out maybe what the first step is to help you manage what's going on with you. That will impact you. It will impact the people around you, including your kids.
Allison, Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Allison, go ahead.
Going to say, I just think, what Emily said is spot on in terms of everybody was impacted. It's different when you see like, a natural disaster in another part of the country and you think, oh, that's really sad for those people. And you might donate, you might get involved somehow, but then it's kind of just off your radar. But this is every single person in the world every single day. So you just can't escape it. Right. So
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. And it becomes, it's like, even when you are, with your family or with your peers, your neighbors, whatever, it's a topic of conversation nearly every day. And so that in and of itself, I think kind of adds to the anxiety. Right. So,
Yeah. Well, we have just over 5 minutes left, so I want to end on a little bit more positive note. What are you hopeful for the youth today? What are you hopeful for they'll learn from the pandemic, or how they'll succeed afterwards or even during?
Well, one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that, this will build some level of resiliency in a really, really wide group of kids. And when I say wide, I basically mean everyone. My kid asking me particularly about what I did during the pandemic, and I didn't have a good answer. The experiences that I had early on in my life, even as an adult, that reminded me I was capable, that reminded me that I could do the hard things, that reminded me that I had resilience and I could kind of push through and figure it out. That is what the pandemic has done for my kids. And I think that's what the pandemic has done for a lot of our youth and young adults. It's reminding them I can do the hard things and I can still come out on the other side and know that it didn't necessarily break me. And I think there's a lot of hope in that.
Yeah. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, you bet. I think there's a lot of people on this call. I keep seeing Peggy's box that have been advocating and fighting for a long time as it relates to mental health needs and the plight and just the importance of focusing on kids over the years. We let's not waste a bad crisis here. I do think that so many positive things in this world, positive things within our agency, positive things within my personal life came in the midst of significant adversity. And so there has never been a better moment. But while I don't think the children's behavioral health system is there, I when we started the work a few years ago, heard no fewer than 24 people say, "Oh, they've tried that for the last 30 years," right? And progress was made. Again, we're not there, but progress was made. The CARES Act, Consolidated Appropriations, and now American Rescue Plan Act. There's $1.8 billion right now in the state of Iowa that's primed for impacting systems around mental health. And so well, operationally, sometimes we're still struggling as an organization. That there's a lot of money right now poised to be invested in good ideas, in things that will, create systematic change. 3.8 billion yesterday was announced for University of Iowa around opioids. Now, I'm a little sad because opioids disproportionately impact adults. Not a ton of kids end up in that space. So we'll get our chance to advocate there for kids. But so much money right now is being invested, and it's going to take good ideas and smart people that have been thinking about systems. And so that is my hope, is that we've increased the level of awareness as it relates to behavioral health, especially the impact of trauma on kids. And now we've got access to funds that we can invest to create not just short-term gains, but long-term systemic changes.
All right. Allison, any last words you'd like to add?
Well, I would just echo, what both of them said. I mean, Emily on resilience and Andrew on systems, and the system that I'm most hopeful for, because I come from it, is the school system. And so I'm hopeful that there will be some prioritization of these issues in schools, and that we can think beyond just academic instruction and think about how we are caring for our kids socially, emotionally, and behaviorally in a systematic, evidence-based way.
All right. Well, could we get that crisis number one more time? Emily, do you have that?
I do. It's 855-581-8111. That's the Your Life Iowa number. You can also go to yourlifeiowa.org. There's live chat there. It's a great resource. It's a great resource as a website. There's a lot of good connections to community partners on it. And it's also just a great kind of front door entry to the system to kind of figure out what's going on and what do you need and how can we help?
All right, it was 3.8 million, not billion. I saw the headline yesterday as billion, and I was like, so I'm like, are you kidding me? So 3.8 million towards the project, that's fine. To take,
You're a little less upset.
yeah, wait, 1,000 times less upset.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Andrew, Emily, Allison. I appreciate your expertise and your insight. I learned a lot from this. I hope everyone else did too. And thank you to those who submitted questions and tuned in. I hope you enjoy the rest of our Iowa Ideas Conference. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.